So, you ever just wonder why Ra looks like that? Like, yeah, I get that SG-1 made various changes, and let's be honest, retcons from the movie, but they did try and explain some of the changes. Granted, most were hand-wave explanations at best. For example, when they examined the Jaffa for the first time, they acknowledged that Ra's Jaffa were just humans. Or when they talked about Ra not being the last of his kind, saying that if one alien took over the body of a human to survive, who's to say that others of the same race couldn't do the same? Now, like I said, these are at best hand-wave explanations, or at worst acknowledging that these are different and moving on. To be honest, most of the explanations for the changes between the movie and the show can best be described as,
I suggest you don't worry about this sort of thing and just enjoy yourself. That goes for you all, too. Yes.
but there's one change that people haven't forgotten and is still talked about to this day, that being why Ra looked like this in the movie. While it's never addressed in the show, there's actually a good reason as to why they never address it. No one saw Ra's true face here. The audience saw it, but the characters did not. The most they had to go on was a picture on the wall, which maybe they assumed was stylized. So if the characters never saw Ra's true face, then later when they meet the snake Goa'uld, they have no reason to think that Ra didn't also look like this. There's an interesting idea that the movie we saw takes place in a separate timeline to SG-1. The same events played out in the SG-1 timeline, but it was the minor details that were different. For example, the O'Neill in the SG-1 timeline that went to Abydos had 2 L's.
There's another Colonel O'Neill with only 1 L. He has no sense of humor at all.
Relevant to this video, Ra just didn't look like this, and always looked like the snake version of his race. But to be honest, I find that answer just a little too easy. Especially since, like I said, they tried to at least address most of the other differences. So in this video, I want to look into this subject and ask, why did Ra look like this within the context of the show's universe? Now, if you've been part of the Stargate fandom for some time, you've probably heard the most popular explanation for this. Ra originally had an Asgard as a host, and when he came to Earth, he took a human as his new host. This explanation is interesting since it does have some lore backing it up. This comes from the Alderac RPGs. Well, sort of. See, when they were making the System Lords RPG, they actually had so much stuff they wanted to add, but couldn't due to space. So they ended up having to drop some of the material from the final product. However, they did release an online supplement to the book, System Lords Plot Hooks. Sadly, the site hosting this is no longer around, but good news, everyone! The Wayback Machine did save it. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to read it for yourself. In this online supplement, they did include that Ra did have an Asgard as a host, and they did give us the identity of this Asgard, Framrir. The entry acknowledges that Ra was said to be part of a dying race in need of a new host, but in truth he inhabited the body of an Asgard. However, the Asgard's genetic makeup was slowly rejecting the symbiote, meaning he needed a new host soon or he would die. When he took a young human as his new host, Framrir was spirited away by a Tok'ra operative back to the Asgard. His people were able to heal him with their advanced technology, but the memories of having been host to such a vile system lord drove him mad. He struck out on his own to launch a violent crusade to wipe out all the Goa'uld, one that continues to this day, or at least when this RPG came out. And that's it. While we did learn Ra did have an Asgard as a host, and the whole dying thing, this doesn't really explain how he got that host. However, since this was supposed to be part of the System Lords RPG, we can look to that for some context clues, which is still not that much. The RPG says the Asgard, along with their former allies, warred with the Goa'uld. Ra was badly injured in a battle, which in another video I did we learned was the one for Ernest's planet, and while fleeing the Asgard, Ra found Earth. And I found an interesting piece of wording in the text. It says Ra transferred his essence into a human host, which sounds odd, and I might have some thoughts on this later, so put a pin in it for the moment. Now, this next part is pure speculation on my part, but I'm combining ideas from the RPGs and the online supplement. Since the two races were at war, Framrir must have been captured right before Ra was forced to flee. He probably took Framrir as a host in an attempt to gain Asgard knowledge, but the blending process was not going well, and he was slowly being rejected by the Asgard's biology. The attack happened, he was forced to flee, discovered Earth, and found humans were easier to repair and take as hosts. This seems like a pretty good explanation for why Ra looked like this. However, there are two issues with this theory. First, the Asgard don't look like that. Yes, both share similar characteristics since both are based on the Grey Aliens design, but there are some big differences. For one, Ra's head looks to be oval-shaped while the Asgard's is more round. The mouth is a big difference as well. Ra's mouth is pretty wide, while the Asgard's is a lot smaller. Finally, you might notice that Ra doesn't appear to have a nose. The Asgard don't really have noses either, but they do have holes where their noses should be. Now, there is a pretty good explanation for why these two aren't exactly the same. See, this isn't what the Asgard look like either.
What?
The short version of them we see is a result of them cloning themselves over and over again. This is the Asgard ancestor we saw in the events of Revelations. He comes from a time before the Asgard genetic manipulation became irreversible around 30,000 years ago. So we can assume this is either their original form or a version closer to it. Either way, we line up these three forms in a timeline, we do see a degradation from one end to the other. If we go by the RPG's timeline, Ra left Fenrir around the year 9177 BC when he discovered Earth. That was around 24,000 years ago, so perhaps in the 6,000 year gap, the Asgard began to look more like this. However, there is a second problem. If Ra did have an Asgard as a host, why did he take an Asgard form when he was about to take a tactical nuke to the face? That's not something the Goa'uld can do. For a while, I didn't have an answer to this until I discovered the book The Bark of Heaven. The plot involves the Goa'uld Mat trying to get revenge on SG-1 for the death of Ra. She does this by tricking SG-1 into undertaking the Trials of Ra, a series of challenges to test one's loyalty and dedication to Ra. And the book introduces some interesting ideas about the Supreme System Lord. As SG-1 completes the trials, Teal'c has a device implanted into him that lets him read the secret language Ra had. What's interesting about this language is that it isn't Goa'uld or any other known language. And yes, they say it's not Furling. It's something that Daniel just can't figure out for a while. Why would someone create their own language to such a degree of complexity? And yes, he is quite annoyed he can't read it, especially since he was the one who was supposed to get that knowledge, but Teal'c pushed him out of the way, fearing for his life. Eventually, an idea clicks in his head. In the movie, it was said that Ra was the last of his kind. In the show, they assumed that it was an embellishment or outright lie Ra made for his slaves. Ra was the first Goa'uld to come to Earth, he ruled over the others, and he was never beaten, at least enough to challenge his supremacy. Yet, no one seems to know anything about him, and earlier in the book, it's established that Ra kept himself separate from the affairs of the other system lords. He has a fully developed written and spoken language that has no resemblance to the Goa'uld language. With all that, Daniel asks the question, what if Ra wasn't a Goa'uld?
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
I'm not kidding with that joke. That's Jack's genuine reaction. He's just like, no, we're not doing this. Daniel does try and say that if one parasitic race can inhabit humans, there's nothing saying another race couldn't do so as well. And in his defense, we have seen races in Stargate that share similar characteristics. But Jack's like, I refuse to accept that. Now, am I saying Ra wasn't a Goa'uld? No. Even Teal'c points out the language could merely have been a way to communicate sensitive information and prevent spying. And at the end of the book, the character Bess says Ra is a Goa'uld, unlike the others, but still one of them. Bess is an interesting character in the story. He helped in the rebellion on Earth, but was captured by Ra, who forced him to be overseer of the trials. He has the ability to change his form. When he first meets SG-1, he's a grotesque creature. But later, when he learns Ra was killed again, I'll explain that in a minute, he takes a more beautiful form and plans to return to his people. SG-1 questions him if his people would still be there, and he assures them they are where they always are. Teal'c asks if he is a Nox, and Bess responds by saying his race are friends of the Nox. After SG-1 leaves, with the aid of seemingly another of his kind, he's able to ascend to a pure energy form. This leads me to believe Bess was an ancient or some kind of ascendant being. Now, you might wonder how Ra was able to capture an ascendant being, even one that might have returned to the lower planes and lost some of his powers. Remember how I said Ra died again? Beth said that Ra had been in the same host for a very long time. According to him, such a close bond for a long time can change the very nature of a being. Ra became unlike any other, with his power transcending death itself. He sacrificed a portion of his soul to trap Bess. During the book, SG-1 encounters and defeats this soul part by trapping it in a statue and smashing it. And the soul part is referred to as a Ka, which is something from Egyptian mythology, how the soul has different parts, the Ka being one of them. And the description of this Ka in the book is interesting, of a ghostly skeletal figure, thin with enormous eye sockets that seem dark or hollow. Now, doesn't that sound kind of familiar? Doesn't that describe the figure Ra turned into right before the nuke went off? Now, the canonicity of the books and the RPGs is something often debated about, but a majority agree they are not canon. That being said, I think we can take some information from them, along with context clues from the shows, to create a theory. And this is a theory I have reached. What if Ra did take an Asgard as a host in an attempt to gain knowledge of the Asgard? While Ra couldn't properly blend with the Asgard, he did gain some knowledge, specifically about ascension. Remember that line from earlier about how Ra transferred his essence into the boy? That sounds incredibly sus when I say it like that. That's a very odd way to say how Goa'uld take over a host, since their physical body enters the host and takes control via the brainstem. However, there is one Goa'uld who you could actually say took control of a host via essence transfer.
Oh, please don't tell me.
Anubis.
I asked you not to tell me.
Anubis was half ascended, and when he took a host, it was his consciousness, or essence, that took control. Again, I think Ra learned ascension from his Asgard host and managed to achieve it. Now, I won't lie, there are some pretty big problems with this that need to be addressed. First is that we learn in the show that due to the Asgard's genetic modifications, they remove the evolutionary ability for their species to ascend. So how could Ra ascend with an Asgard if they couldn't? I have two counters to that point. First, we don't know what exact modifications made it impossible for them to ascend. I don't think the mere act of messing with one's DNA makes it impossible for one to ascend. The ancients had some history with genetic modifications as well. It's not clear if the ATA gene was something natural to their species or added on later. But it's very likely they made the DNA resequencer, and later on in Pegasus, they made a machine that would speed up the evolutionary process that would allow ascension. Granted, those didn't exactly end well, but it shows that even the ancients who achieved ascension did use gene modifications from time to time. Perhaps whatever Asgard Ra was in didn't have the modifications that prevented ascension. Now, yes, that's not the best argument, but that's why I have point 2. Ra probably doesn't need the Asgard body to ascend, only the knowledge. While the Asgard might not be experts on the subject, I think it's safe to assume they must know something about it, since they would find they had made it impossible for them to ascend. Perhaps Ra got really lucky and took the body of an Asgard who was studying ascension to learn how to save his people. And heck, some of the books introduced an ascendant Asgard, though this was before the use of gene modification began to be used by the Asgard. Now, the main issue with asking if Ra ascended is the rules of ascension are kind of vague.
Yeah, it's not exactly a clear-cut set of instructions, is it?
No.
At minimum, it seems to require some combination of biological and spiritual elements. Now, it's hard to say if biologically the Goa'uld can ascend. They're not too young of a race, but they're also not all that old. Yes, Anubis ascended, but he had help from an ascendant being, one he tricked. Honestly, I say it's a toss-up if they can or not. But at minimum, we know the Goa'uld searched for a powerful host. Maybe Ra was ahead of the curve and advanced his own biology sometime prior. The spiritual part is actually kind of easier to give a guess on, but also hard at the same time. Now keep in mind, when I say spiritual, I don't mean religious or belief. Again, the requirements of this are kind of vague, and various sources will say certain things. Stuff like learning to let go of shame, doubt, fear, and all that stuff. There's this idea that one has to be pure of spirit and very good to the core to achieve ascension, which I disagree with. This is because of the existence of people or groups such as Anubis, Audria, and the Ori as a whole. Now, Anubis you can make a case against, since again he had help and therefore shouldn't count. But Adria and the Ori managed to achieve ascension, and they were certainly not good to the core. There's this weird argument I've seen that the Ori were good people once, and no. Their entire history is them trying to kill the ancients and take power from their followers. The only real exception to this seems to come from some stories in the Book of Origin, which Daniel theorized may have been based on real events. But I'd argue that's not really a reliable source, since the Ori wrote it. We've seen one of their priors shift a message in one of the stories to fit a narrative. Who's to say all the stories aren't just lies, or the truth was twisted to fit their goals? Audrey ascended right in front of our eyes, and she's not pure of spirit. All she had was the biological ability and the knowledge on how to do it. Like I said a few times now, the rules of ascension are vague. And I think part of the problem is we only ever hear about ascension from how the ancients did it. But to quote a man with a fern on his head,
that your way is not the only way.
Overall, it's hard to say if Ra could or couldn't ascend, but the rules and timeline are vague enough that I think there's a decent chance he could have if he knew what to do. But wouldn't the others step in and send him back like Anubis? Not necessarily. See, Anubis was partially sent back as a punishment to Oma since she kept helping those from the lower planes to ascend. Most of the ascended ancients believe that if you deserve ascension, then you should be able to get there on your own. If Ra achieved ascension on his own, though in this theory he stole that information, then he might have been left alone for the most part. Because I think there's another component to this idea. Ra might have been able to ascend, but only partially. We know there are different planes of existence between the mortal one and the true ascension one. The Asgard might have known something of ascension, but maybe not everything. And Ra being partly ascended does explain a few things. First, maybe this is another reason why the others didn't step in and stop him. On top of getting there on his own, again kind of, he didn't come all the way. I'm sure they warned him that if he used his powers he would be punished, but he's allowed to do things he could have done when he was a Goa'uld, such as taking a host. This also might explain a few of Ra's actions, such as how he was able to maintain his status as Supreme System Lord, or why he encouraged the whole God thing. Perhaps he learned the power he could gain through worship, similar to the Ori's, giving him a way to fight the others if ever needed. For the other System Lords, their role as gods was to maintain control over their slaves and their own egos. And while all this is definitely true for Ra, it also could have been a source of power for him. Maybe he spread the story that he was the last of his kind to encourage soul worship for himself. Now, there are still issues to talk about. For example, if Ra was partially ascendant, why didn't his host degrade like Anubis's did? Anubis's host degraded because of his unstable energy, probably a side effect of being cast down. Ra in this theory achieved partial ascension on his own, so perhaps his host didn't suffer from the same effects. Or maybe he had clones he would cycle through when they would begin to decay, or maybe his sarcophagus was designed to reverse some of the damage. As to why Ra's ascendant form looks the way it does, and not the snake form, it's possible it may merely resemble the last host he had. Anubis had a humanoid form too, and not the snake one. Maybe it's up to personal preference, or this is how Ra saw himself before he ascended, so that dictates what he looks like. I know something interesting when you put Anubis's ascendant form next to Ra's form from the movie. I'd argue there's a lot of similarities. Oval-shaped head, very large eyes, and a wide mouth. Maybe this is just the default form for the Goa'uld if they ascend. The ancients take on a light form, the Ori fire, and the Goa'uld this strange skeleton form. Or perhaps this is the default form for those in between the planes. Or maybe Anubis himself had an Asgard as a host. As I worked on this theory, I began to wonder if Anubis had learned Ra achieved some kind of ascension and sought out the power to do so in order to challenge him. So to sum up my theory, because I've been a bit all over the place, during the war with the Asgard, Ra captured one of them. He took him as a host in order to learn the Asgard's secrets. But the Asgard's biology prevented a full blend and Ra was being rejected. Despite this, he managed to gain some knowledge from the Asgard, such as ascension. He began looking into the subject, but an attack forced him to flee. He discovered Earth, but he was running out of time. he needed to leave his host and use whatever knowledge on ascension he had to achieve some sort of partial ascension. The others stepped in and gave him a breakdown on the rules and how they would step in and stop him if he tries anything. His first action is to take a host on the planet he discovered, and from there builds up the empire we all know and love. However, there is one last problem that needs to be addressed. If we say Ra achieved some kind of partial ascension, how did he die? A nuke might have destroyed his body, but could never kill any ascendant being, even only one partially so. Anubis was never truly killed, only stalemated for all eternity. So if Ra was ascendant, why did he die at the end of the movie? Why did he show his true form in those final moments? Well, that's just it, isn't it? Are we sure Ra was killed in that explosion?
Yeah, we're sure. Nothing could have survived that explosion.
No, it can't be.
They're all dead, my lord. Excellent. The first of my traitorous followers have fallen. Let us welcome Ra back to Abydos with the blood of the unfaithful.
But that's a topic for another day. What do you all think? Do you like my little theory that Ra achieved some form of ascension? Or do you all think I've just been talking crazy? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Leave a like and subscribe. Follow me on my social medias. And remember...
Okay, Palpatine. If you're gonna do this, do it. Let go of your anger. Let go of your hate. Oh, hey, there it goes. Oh, that's nice. You